Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Many U.S. officials have said enough is enough and resigned in protest of U.S. policy on Israel. But is the Biden administration listening? Let's get to the bottom line. They all had important jobs in the U.S. government, several from the State Department, one at the Education Department, and even one from the intelligence community. But some have left quietly in protest of the U.S. government's policy towards Israel's war on Gaza. Others have chosen to stay in their jobs, but they make their dissent clear internally. But at least 9 officials have publicly resigned, saying they simply could no longer work with the Biden administration. Today, we're speaking with one of those government officials, Hala Rharrit, former U.S. diplomat and State Department spokesman for the Middle East and North Africa, who resigned in April after 18 years in the Foreign Service. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just ask you to tell us, why did you resign?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Steve. I really appreciate it. I resigned because 18 years ago, when I joined the Foreign Service, I swore an oath to defend the Constitution, and this policy, honestly, is in violation of that. It's a violation of U.S. law, and I can go into detail in terms of how our surge of unconditional military assistance is violating not one, not two, but multiple U.S. regulations. As an American diplomat, I could not be part of that. It's also a failed militaristic policy that hasn't achieved any of its objectives. And I was documenting that on a daily basis back to the department, the implications of this policy, how it was indeed not keeping Israel any safer, how it was destabilizing to the Middle East, and obviously, it was absolutely a devastation to the Palestinians themselves. And finally, it was undermining U.S. credibility throughout the region. And again, this is something that I was reporting back to Washington. And my job as an American diplomat was to advance U.S. interests, promote the United States. And this policy made it impossible to do so. The fact that it was an immoral policy, an inhumane policy as well, added on. And it came to a point where I realized I could no longer be part of the administration.
So walk us through that process a little bit, sort of the nuts and bolts. I mean, you're a Foreign Service officer. You've been doing this job for 18 years. I'm sure there are moments in the past when you said, United States may have screwed that. But you felt this deeply, and you were engaged internally and writing memos. Kind of describe that process for us, because I don't think our viewers understand what it means and how it feels to dissent when your bosses are doing something that you don't like.
Absolutely. And you make a very good point, Steve. It's not about personal opinion, because obviously there have been plenty of times over the last 18 years, especially working in difficult places throughout the world, where diplomats don't always have the same opinions as the official U.S. government policy. But as diplomats, generally, we are always able to provide our professional expertise. We're always able to be heard. And that has been, from my experience over the last 18 years, the spirit of the State Department. And I always felt like it was a rewarding career. I was helping my country and I was doing my part. So I'm a political officer by training. I started out my career in Yemen as a political officer and a human rights officer. Served in multiple countries all around the region and other places all around the world as well, including Hong Kong and South Africa. My last assignment was the first public-facing job I actually had. I was a spokesperson, as you mentioned, for the Arab world. So my job was to be
you were the face of the State
Literally,
Department and the face of the Biden administration. You were having to go out and talk to the Middle East, North Africa region and say, hey, here's what we're up to and why we're defending it.
That's exactly right. And I was very proud to do that. I was very proud to do that. And it was an honor for me to represent my country. And before October 7th, I had done well over 100 interviews on a range of topics: Sudan, Russia, Ukraine, China, whatever the Arab audience wanted to hear a U.S. government perspective on. And I felt that that was advancing U.S. interests. It was helping tell America's story. But after October 7th, the talking points that I was receiving were, first of all, dehumanizing to the Palestinians. They were neglecting the plight of the Palestinians. They were, of course, very heavily focused on Israel has a right to defend itself. From my perspective, especially early on, it wasn't even that. It was neglecting the Palestinian plight altogether. So I, along with all of my colleagues in the region, watched in horror on October 7th when we saw the terrorist attacks occur, right? And then as foreign language spokespeople, we wait for Washington to get ahead of the story, and then we come out, usually after the situation calms down. The situation never calmed down, obviously, with this particular conflict. So when we started receiving our talking points, they were really just focused so much on, of course, the horrific terrorist attacks of October 7th, but the civilian death toll in Gaza was rising so drastically, so quickly, and that was just being ignored. And if you remember early on, the president even discounted the number of civilian casualties in Gaza, and he was questioning them, which again was a dehumanizing tactic that the Israelis were using, which was not something that was in our favor. We should not have been following suit. So in good conscience, I knew the reaction to those talking points in Arab media. I knew that the reaction would be disastrous. And what I actually began doing is I began documenting that. And I began reporting that back to Washington, explaining, look, our talking points, this policy, it's not being accepted by this part of the world. It's actually being rejected, and it's causing increasing, growing anti-Americanism. I, in good conscience, cannot be promoting these talking points when I know it's actually hurting my country as opposed to helping.
So you were filing these reports. Were they being read? Were you getting a response?
They were
from
being
internal officials inside the State Department?
They were being read, and I was getting responses, and they were going to very senior levels. So in addition to reflecting on our own messaging, they were also showing to Washington what Arabs were consuming throughout the region, because I was doing a roundup of Arab traditional media and social media. And some of that included the graphic images of the children being killed and U.S. bomb fragments that were shown right next to these children. And I was explaining the level of U.S. complicity and how the Arab public was consuming this on a daily basis and blaming us, not Israel, but blaming us for the deaths and the carnage in Gaza, and that we needed to change course because, again, this was hurting U.S. national security interests.
What were the responses?
The responses were, some of them were humane, understanding that it was a tragic situation. Some people were affected and impacted by the images. I also simultaneously faced silencing and I faced sidelining. Some people did not want those reports to continue to be sent. I was eventually told in January that the reports were no longer needed, even though obviously the conflict had not ended. But the message was clear by January that the policy was the policy. And as I was told, quote, the devastation in Gaza was understood.
So you're an 18-year veteran of
Yes.
this administration, well, not of this administration, many administrations, serving as a Foreign Service officer, and you are being sidelined and squelched and told to, basically stay in your place and no more.
I was also being pressured to go on air and deliver the talking points in Gaza, on Gaza. And the point that this messaging strategy, which, by the way, there was really no messaging strategy. It was just go out and deliver these talking points without really thinking about the ramifications of them. I was pressured to go out and do interviews, and I refused. Again, not because I personally disagreed with the policy, but because I knew that messaging was hurting U.S. interests. It was making people across the Arab world want to burn American flags. It was making people reject the United States. And I had worked for 18 years to do the opposite. I had worked for 18 years to strengthen the U.S. ties with that part of the world and other countries. And in good conscience, I could not be the face of this war.
So let me ask you a blunt question, and I don't know how to frame it
Sure.
probably in a correct way, but you're an Arab American. You're a Moroccan American. You're an American, happen to have heritage and legacy from Morocco. Were they trying to use you to sugarcoat a policy that you believed was abhorrent?
That's a very interesting question. Look, I don't want to speak about the State Department as a monolith, right? Because there are many different officers, there are many different senior officials. So I want to be careful there in terms of how I label the institution. I can tell you my experience with some, okay? I was definitely told someone like you would be great to have out there right now. Someone that looks like you, it would be a very effective thing. So obviously that was quite demeaning and not the point of how we should be thinking as a State Department as well. I can tell you I did not become a diplomat to sell a war. I definitely did not become a diplomat to serve to sell a plausible genocide. I became a diplomat to promote peace, to promote American interests. So there was the drumbeat. There was the drumbeat of you must promote this policy no matter what the ramifications are. And the entire time I was saying, can we please see what is actually happening on the ground? Can we see that our 3 service members in Jordan just got killed? Can we see that there are protests throughout the Arab world and there's social unrest to unprecedented levels in modern times? We need to reassess the implications of this policy on our own U.S. national security. We can stand by an ally, yes, but we cannot do so at the expense of our own U.S. national security.
So what explains the course in your mind that President Biden has taken?
Steve, this is a question I ask myself every day and try to figure it out because honestly, I did not want to resign. I was very proud of being an American diplomat and I kept on holding on, hoping that we collectively as diplomats and as the U.S. government interagency would be able to affect change. And this is what I came up with, right? This is just through my own deliberations what I came up with, really three points. The first, I think, is ideology. President Biden is a self-proclaimed Zionist. He truly believes in the ironclad commitment of the United States to Israel. But again, my point is, even with that, you have to realize that you can support the state of Israel in an actually substantive way, not this way, because it will not lead to an actual security of the state of Israel. So then that takes me to the second point. You can maintain that ideology, but not do this, right? So my second point, and one that was quite eye-opening for me as a diplomat, is that a lot of our foreign policy is run by our domestic politics.
Right.
And that is undeniable. As a diplomat, I was never allowed to receive any type of funding, even a cup of coffee. We really had to practically report it, right? We had to be very transparent in anything, but our politicians, the ones that are making the decisions to send these unconditional arms, they receive campaign contributions from the arms industry, from the pro-Israel lobby. Those drive decisions, not foreign policy experts, and critically, not what's good for U.S. national security, but what's good for campaign contributions. That may get me in trouble saying that out loud in this town, but it's the sad truth. And thirdly, I think there is an embedded dehumanization of Palestinians. And I saw that through our talking points. I saw that serving in the State Department. This almost expectation that it's okay if those people there get killed. We saw many U.S. government officials express outrage on October 7th, as they absolutely should have. My heart was also breaking, as they absolutely should have. But it is wild to me, and it is devastating to me to see those same officials barely blink an eye when we're talking about 15,000 children killed. You want to argue how many Hamas fighters are in the overall number? Let's just talk about the children. Where are the tears? Where is the horror? Where is the action to stop these children from getting killed? And I think it's just an embedded dehumanization and obviously racism, to be quite frank, where it's okay if these people starve to death. And when I realized those three things for myself, that is also when I decided to resign, because I couldn't single-handedly change those three things from within the system.
How are some of your colleagues feeling who have not resigned? How many are not resigning but feel similarly?
Look, Steve, I've been asked this question a lot since I've resigned, and I'll tell you two things. One, there are a lot of people who are very, very upset about this policy, but I also want to say that there are a lot of people that are willfully enabling this policy.
Right.
Right? And that's the sad truth. For whatever reason, financial concerns, or they believe in it, which even most don't believe in it, but they are doing it for career advancement, they're enabling the policy. And I would still say, from my vantage point, that's actually the majority. They're doing what they're supposed to do, and they're not questioning, even if they know it's wrong. But there is
so I just want to say, you're saying something very
minority.
powerful. I mean, Bernie Sanders has said it, Chris Van Hollen, Senator Van Hollen has said it, that there is a culpability that the United States government has in these actions.
Absolutely.
That the International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Court of Justice says genocide may in fact be underway here. So they said we cannot afford that culpability. And you're saying there are people who are knowingly culpable.
I had multiple conversations, and there are people that have the mindset of just do your job. And I said, but I was hired for my expertise. I was hired to help my country. Obviously, the president at the end of the day makes decisions, and that's absolutely correct. But the level of silencing and sidelining, and I want to say a culture of fear in the State Department that I've seen over the last few months is unprecedented. That you're not even able to articulate your concerns because you're worried about some type of blowback. So to your point of how many people, there are a significant number. And I know that there are a lot of people that are having a very difficult time in the administration right now. Many of them reached out to me, but there are so many others, countless. Most of them are too scared to speak up because they're worried. Some of them do speak up. What me and the others that have resigned are trying to encourage people to do from within the system is, you don't have to resign, but use your voice. There is power in your voice, but it has to also be a collective, right? Because if there's a climate of fear and most people are scared to use their voice, then the status quo remains, but that is a detriment to our country. That's not what the State Department is supposed to be. That's not what our country is supposed to be. We're supposed to have diverse views, and then we make informed decisions. We're not supposed to be an authoritarian regime that no matter what, the status quo will remain, and a willful violation of the law.
When you talk about dissent, if I were to go to the State Department, they said, we have channels for dissent. We have channels for people to file things, and that Secretary of State Antony Blinken reads every one of these. Is that true or not true?
I think it is true that Secretary Blinken reads the dissent cables, because I think there's a responsibility there with the dissent channel. But I can tell you that dissent is not just reported through to the dissent channels. I wrote front channel cables. It's not the dissent channel. It's a front channel. Many embassies and consulates are writing cables of concern and reporting facts on the ground. Washington is then supposed to assess that. But this has been the issue. So much has been reported and no action has been taken. And what we saw with the National Security Memorandum, and I'm sure you're aware of right. Stacey Gilbert, who resigned, there was a willful changing of the facts, lying and getting rid of what the subject matter experts were saying about what the facts on the ground are.
Let's explain to the public what
Sure.
National Security Memorandum,
Sure.
I think National Security Memorandum 20 says and requires.
Okay. So Congress required the State Department to report back whether or not Israel, one of the things was whether or not Israel was prohibiting humanitarian assistance from entering Gaza. Because if that's the case, that prompts a policy review and a pause on U.S. arms shipment from the Foreign Assistance Act. The Foreign Assistance Act ensures that if there is a country that stops humanitarian assistance from entering to a population in need, we cannot give that country weapons. So the national...
I just want to interrupt
something?
right here because
Sure.
I'm going to read the
Sure.
statement on May 10th,
Yes,
2024, on Israel restricting flow of aid. This report says, we do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport or delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance.
And that is a lie.
It is, well, we see it on I think, pretty authentic video and reporting constantly on the inability to move and the frustration which the administration itself, I mean, John Kirby, a spokesperson for the National Security Council in the White House, has said, talked about their frustration with Israel interfering with aid and acknowledging they were interfering with aid. But it's, so I'm just, I mean, to call this as Orwellian is an understatement.
I can tell you as an American diplomat of 18 years, Steve, I have had so much horror throughout this policy because this is not the America that I know. This is not the State Department that I know, and this is not the America that I want us to be, or any of us should want us to be. No matter what side of the aisle you are on, you should agree that changing documents written by subject matter experts, so Stacey Gilbert was one of the subject matter experts, and we have American government officials determining the facts on the ground through our own mechanisms which are verified, explaining exactly how Israel is prohibiting aid. And then once it goes to senior officials at the political level, they are changing those words and saying that Israel is not in violation of that, only to be able to continue an unconditional flow of aid. That, for me, is tantamount to a violation of the law. There has been so much spin. There's been so many loopholes. There's been so much maneuvering to try to maintain this unconditional flow of aid, which, again, is to the detriment of, obviously, Palestinians, but also to Israeli security in the long run. It doesn't make any sense. And that's why I ultimately also decided to resign because it was also hurting everyone. Everyone. There's no side that is gaining from this failed militaristic policy.
I should also add with this National Security Memorandum, another requirement of it is to validate that the use of weapons provided is being used within the humanitarian guidelines that the United States requires, and that in that area too, it was determined that Israel, for the most part, was not, that there were some concerns with some detachments, but that our concerns were waived after we looked at Israeli inspections. So is that part of the package of your concerns?
Look, absolutely. Look, the bottom line is that it's a political will issue. That's what it is. If there's political will to acknowledge certain things, we will acknowledge it. If there is no political will, we will find a way to work around it. And now the political will is, by any means necessary, continue unconditional military assistance. So we have Leahy vetting, we have the Arms Export Control Act, we have the National Security Memorandum Foreign Assistance Act. And what our people have been doing, instead of applying these laws, they've been trying to figure out how to wiggle their way around these laws in order to justify this policy, because that's what the political leadership is instructing and signifying them to do.
Let me ask you just real quickly, as we're out of time, but on the issue of America's brand in the world, which you were part of selling.
Absolutely.
What's the state of America's brand in the world of human rights, of promoting civic justice, of basically trying to position itself as a promulgator of a better world? What is the state of the American brand today?
Well, I can tell you specifically in the Arab world, because that's where I was working and that's where I was monitoring. It's devastated. And I think it'll be a generation, at least, unless we act literally now, that we will be able to regain our credibility. And for me, as an American, not even as a diplomat, but just as an American, it is so sad, because we had gained so much ground in the Arab world. We've had a rough history. But we've always been able to come back from it. We've always, as Americans, been able to maintain our ideals of, okay, there have been issues, but we're still a country of laws. We're still a country of press freedom. We're still a country of human rights, despite all these issues. But now, when we're seen as enabling the mass killings of civilians, we have no ground to stand on human rights. When we're seen not defending the hundreds of journalists that are being killed in Gaza, we can't say anything on press freedom. And I can say that this is not just respective to the Middle East. We could no longer even say anything on Russia or Ukraine because we had lost credibility on that, or China, or anything for that matter. So it's quite devastating at the moment. And again, if we change course now, if we apply U.S. law, it's not a punitive measure to Israel, but if we just abide by U.S. law, change our policy, we need to change course.
Well, we'll have to end it there. Former U.S. Foreign Service Officer Hala Rharrit, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing with us your story.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's the bottom line? The U.S. government employs almost 3 million people. Supporters of the status quo will say, okay, so around 9 have resigned over the Biden administration's Gaza policy. What's the big deal? It is a big deal. This is not a numbers game. It's about principles. I'm aware of some diplomats and some military analysts with impeccable reputations who have nothing but respect for the folks who've resigned out of moral and ethical considerations. There are signs that these resignations are heard and felt, but it's not clear that they're making a difference. But here's the real issue. America believes that it does reflect diverse opinions. But at this moment, in this crisis, those diverse voices are being squelched, sidelined, and silenced on Gaza. And that's the bottom line.